people, and that's just the upfront operating costs. That's not the hidden costs of the pension funds, the bonds we talked about earlier to build the prisons and stuff like that. We have huge prison bureaucracies that, don't really produce a lot. I called up the Connecticut prison system one time looking for the person to talk to for a public records request I'd filed. And the person I was talking to on the phone said, well, I got to find that person. I'm not really sure where they're at in the building or what their extension is. And I'm kind of like, well, it can't be that hard. And she tells me, well, sir, we have over 2,000 people working here at DOC headquarters. And I'm like, you've only got 18,000 prisoners. How can you have 2,000 people in your headquarters shuffling paper? And I think that's one of the things that people often don't think about is, these huge bureaucracies that have, come about as that jobs program for mass incarceration. That's one of the things that's really changed in the last 30 or 40 years. And one of the things when I talk about we spend a lot of money to make things worse is, one of the things that we've known for a long time, which I think it's a real common sense thing, especially for I think probably people in this room, is that generally the more education that people in prison get, the lower their recidivism rates. If you give people an education, by the time they get to a bachelor's degree in prison, their recidivism rate goes down to around 6%, and by the time you're at the master's degree level, the recidivism rate is 0%. So, of course, we've eliminated all higher education in prisons. So, we know that on average, anywhere between 60 and 80% of the people in prison have drug or alcohol addiction problems that probably landed them in prison or at least contributed to their being in prison. So, of course, we'll eliminate drug and alcohol treatment programs. So, and I think we get kind of predictable results with that. We also know that as far as putting people in prison, that the more ties they maintain with the community, the stronger their family structures, the less likely they are to recidivate. So when we get back to how that $1 trillion has been spent, as I mentioned earlier, it's been spent largely building prisons in remote rural areas far from the families and their support networks that they come from. And then you compound that with, remote rural location, draconian visiting policies, very strict censorship policies, and then you monetize telephone contact by charging people an arm and a leg to maintain telephone contact with their loved ones, to monetize that human contact and hold people financial hostage if they want to have contact with their loved ones. This is what I mean when I say that there's been a lot of conscious decisions made. And I think this is one of the things that illustrates the fact that underclasses don't happen on their own. They need a lot of help from above. And fortunately in this country, they've got more help than they need. And this is one of those things too where, it costs a lot of money to be poor in this country. And it costs a lot of money to be enmeshed in the criminal justice system. We've got control unit prisons where prisoners are, on any given day, 80 to 90,000 prisoners are being held in cages with no human contact. The official party line is, they're only held in the cells by themselves 23 hours a day, and the other hour a day they get put into a bigger cage if they're lucky. We have supermax prisons and maximum security prisons. That $1 trillion has been spent mostly on building maximum security prisons. Very little has been spent on low security prisons. Our prison systems are also breeding grounds for disease. The Center for Disease Control has traced drug-resistant tuberculosis, MRSA, and HIV to prisons and jails around the country, Legionnaire's disease as well. Any given year, 25% of HIV-positive people are going to pass through a prison or jail. You'd think from a public health perspective this would be a great intervention point, but not in this country. One of the things, too, is that I try not to end things just on a totally dismal and gloomy note, and I don't want to bum everyone out, but one of the things that we've seen in general is that we've seen some prison closures over the last few years as there's been more of an economic crisis, and economic crisis at the state level, which is they can't balance their budgets or they realize they actually have to keep paying for these investments that they've made in this vast carceral machine. And one of the things we've seen is that they close some prisons, but the prison population remains the same as they jam more prisoners into smaller spaces. Some states have actually slightly reduced their prison populations, but I think it's too soon to tell yet if that's statistically significant or if it's a long-term trend or just a blip. Some of them, like the Federal Bureau of Prisons, continues to grow exponentially with no end in sight. More importantly, I don't think we see any interest at the state or federal legislative levels to shorten sentences or reduce prison sentences. Instead, we see the increase in sentencing and sentences, and also increased criminalization of more and more activities. Pretty much there doesn't seem to be any political interest or will by the ruling class in this country to do anything about mass incarceration. They seem to speak with one voice on that. And I'd say probably mass incarceration for now seems to be here to stay as a permanent fixture, even if it stabilizes a little bit at its current numbers of 2.5 million, or it only grows less than it's been growing in the past, absent some type of economic collapse or such. Thomas Mathiasen is a Norwegian criminologist, and one of his comments was that repressive regimes appear to be stable right up until the moment they collapse. And as someone who got a degree in Soviet history in 1987, I think that's one of the things that's kind of interesting, is that none of the professors that I took classes from, none of the authors that I read at the time, no one predicted that 3 years from the date I got my degree in Soviet history there would be no more Soviet Union to study. So I think that's one of the things that, on that happy, optimistic note, I think that's kind of the best we can hope for. But one of the things that I have to say too, though, is one of the things I really like coming to places like Urbana here and going to a lot of places around the country is that, there's a lot of people that I think are doing a lot of good work, especially at the local level, to counteract some of the more negative effects of the American police state. And I think that one of the things that's important to note, though, is I think the disconnect between us as Americans and the American people and our political and ruling classes. Because one of the things, let me ask you this, of the people in this room, how many people in here believe that possession of marijuana should be a criminal offense? Not a single one. How many of you know someone who believes that possession of marijuana should be a criminal offense? Okay, that's good. Now, can anyone name a single politician elected to statewide office that thinks that possession of marijuana should not be a criminal offense? Anywhere in the country? Who? Yes, through voter initiatives. Not the legislature, not being signed by the governor. That, I'm not talking about thinks or says, I mean it actually does it. And this is like the other thing. How many people in this country support the death, how many people in this room support the death penalty? None? Okay. On any given day, at least 30% of the American public doesn't support the death penalty for whatever reason, whether it's for moral grounds, religious grounds, or hey, you're just not down with killing, whatever. But then when you start looking at the thing about, for our American elected politicians, how many politicians elected to statewide political office in this country are publicly against the death penalty? Even the ones that purport to be, I'm Catholic. Well, and that just means you don't want women to get an abortion, but you're down with killing. So, because, the abortion thing might lose you some votes, you're not going to lose enough votes on the death penalty for it to matter. And that's one of the things that I think is important to note, is that political disconnect between I think us as the American people, and I think that's one of the things that, one of the reasons I started Prison Legal News 23 years ago was with the belief that if more people knew about what was actually going on in American prisons and jails with their tax money and in their name, we'd have a push for change. And maybe I'm naive or a little overly optimistic, but I still believe that. And I look at it that I can't do anything about apathy, but I can do something about ignorance. So anyways, on that happy note, if anyone's got any questions, let's hear it.
Get the mic, and then we're going to make a quick announcement.
Okay.
So, quick announcement is that he's going to be in a hurry to catch a plane, so we're going to end right at 1. So if you have questions, please keep those hands up so we can get to them. Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming, and I certainly appreciate it, your honesty today. Just a few points. I must use your statement. I mean, I do vote, but it is getting very hard to find candidates to vote for. So I do have to agree with you on that. And it's getting harder to convince our younger people why they should vote as well. So I do thank you for pointing that out, and I guess I just have to work a little bit harder.
I have a hard time being convinced of that one too, so.
So I understand that. Also, I want to thank you for appreciating the work that people do on the ground. But just for some reason, I believe that it's easier to just continue doing things locally, grassroots, than it is to try to reach for the stars, because if they see what you're doing locally, I think that'll eventually reach.